Welcome to the Heartful Parent Podcast. I'm your host, Christine Keating. In this podcast, we talk about it all, our parenting, our partnering, and our professional lives, because they are all a part of us, and we were never meant to do this alone. Hey y'all, it's Christy. I'm back here for another episode of the Heartful Parent Podcast. And listen, if you have been following along with the podcast for any period of time, you know that there are some really phenomenal guests who so generously give of their time and their expertise to be on the pod, to talk with you, to share their wisdom, right? And I'm so grateful to each and every one of them. That being said, I have to confess that this week's guest, and actually she's going to be on for 2 episodes, is an extra special one for me because of our personal relationship that has sort of grown out of our professional work. So this week's guest is a friend, a colleague, an incredible woman by the name of Christine Muenz. And I have known Christine for over 14 years. As you will hear in this podcast interview, we met when my oldest, Macy, was a teeny tiny little peanut. And we met in a parent baby class that Christine was teaching. So Christine is a parenting educator. She's a lactation educator, and she's also a nationally known infant feeding specialist. She teaches numerous classes at a Seattle area hospital, and she also lectures at conferences for professionals who work with pregnant and postpartum families. That is her kind of professional bio. But there's so much more. So one of the things that we share in this podcast is kind of how we met. Christine really was there at the birth of my business, not at the birth of my child, mind you, but at the birth of my business, which sometimes feels like another child that I take care of. And I now know her whole family. And in fact, her daughter, Grace, was a nanny for my oldest. When she was in high school, she would pick her up from school on the days that I was working at the prosecutor's office. And then she nannied for us for a while when we had our little one. So Grace was well out of high school at that point, but she helped take care of Marin when she was just an infant. And so I feel very tied to Christine and her family. But I think that connection, that tie, is rooted in a deep professional respect. And as I hope you hear on this podcast, we also just have a lot of fun together. We have a really fun rapport, and this might feel a little different than some of our other podcast episodes. So I'm going to let our conversation kind of unfold and let you hear how we know one another even more, because I don't want to spoil all the good stuff now. But if you think about what I shared about Christine's credentials, that is what we're going to dig into today. And if you don't have a baby, we're not really talking much about babies. This really is what we dive into, is how the way that we feed our children when they are infants grows and changes, expands when they get older, and how sometimes the decisions that we make and the battles that we pick and the fights that we fight can have unintended effects with our kids and our families, right? It can turn the mealtime into a battlefield. It can, result in kids having an unhealthy relationship with their bodies and food and all of that kind of stuff. So we're going to kind of dig into all of that. And as you will hear, Christine is now officially designated as a friend of the pod. She will be back. We will talk about many things because, she and I both have many opinions that we will relish sharing with you. But today that we're going to start with that piece about feeding and and just the way that we feed our children as parents. Now, we've talked about feeding before on the podcast, but this really is sort of a different perspective, a different approach, and maybe even a little bit of an answer to some of the previous conversations that we had that I think were really fantastic and also left parents, some of you, saying well, what do we do now, right? Where do we go with this? So we're going to start opening up that conversation again, and this won't be the last time we talk about this. So one thing that you'll hear is this conversation with Christine and I, we can talk forever. It went perhaps a bit longer than either one of us intended. So we're going to break it up into 2 episodes. You'll hear the first part of our conversation today, and then 2 weeks from now, you will hear the rest of our conversation. Because there's just so much good stuff that we couldn't get it all into one episode. So without a lot of further ado, I'm not going to give you much more introduction. I'm going to let this goofy, crazy, fun, and important conversation with Christine and I sort of speak for itself. So enjoy. Yeah. Christine Muenz, you're here in my office in real life. And we're talking about a whole bunch of stuff today. And this won't be the first time that we talk, but welcome to the pod.
And won't be the last time because...
Oh, did I say the first?
You did say the first time. Yay! My whole goal in life is to be known as friend of the pod. That's all I want. Every time I listen to your podcast, there are things I want to talk about afterwards. I have comments, I have thoughts. So,
well, I'm putting the virtual crown on your head and it says at the top, friend of the pod.
All right. Yay.
Okay. So tell the people how we met.
Christy came into my parenting class. I teach parenting classes at a Seattle area hospital and have been doing so for 27 years now. And so Christy came into my class when her oldest was just a few weeks old. And the way I remember it is...
And you guys, this story gets better every time Christine tells it.
Okay. I was lecturing at a conference once, sidebar. I was lecturing at a conference once, and after I gave a talk, a woman came up to me, a participant in the conference. She came up to me and she said, in my culture, the storytellers are the wisdom keepers. Your stories hold so much wisdom. And I thought, there it is. Vindication for all the people who say my stories change a little bit over time. It's because I'm a wisdom keeper, Christy.
You are a wisdom keeper. Okay.
Okay. So anyway, Christy came into my class with her baby and had a couple of questions. And as I was answering those questions, Christy had sort of some rebuttal, and I would say litigated me a little bit to make sure that I knew my stuff, knew what I was talking about, and that I was teaching evidence-based best practice infant care, which I was. And in that moment, we fell a little bit in love with each other. And then you came to class religiously every week for the first year of...
Oh, no, but not just the first year. My group and me as one of the activists made you and the other teachers continue teaching until our babies were 18 months old.
Well, and then you all are the ones who made us start a toddler series because for all these 15 years now, we've been teaching toddler classes. And then I just, I don't know, we're kindred spirits and we both want to make the world better for parents and kids. And when you were ready to leave the prosecutor's office, you came to my house and we had a bottle of wine and a couple of notepads and wrote ideas for what the next chapter of your professional life was going to be. And that's how The Heartful Parent was born in my living room. So
true story.
See, and I didn't embellish. That is really what happened.
That really is a true story. Okay. That really is a true story. Okay. So, we've been doing this podcast now for 40 some episodes, or I don't even know where we are right now. Almost a year, right? February 14th, Valentine's Day 2023 is when we launched this podcast. And I have to tell you that Christine and I have been talking about having her on the podcast since episode 1, because we've also talked about having a separate podcast that was the two of us, but we'd get into a lot of trouble.
Right.
She's not kidding when she says, like, there's a lot of things that we could talk about, because she listens to the podcast and then has thoughts and comments, and which probably all of you who are listening do too, right?
And here's the thing I always think. It's parenting. It's not policy and procedure. And so even though you have some incredible guest on who says incredible things, sometimes I take 90% of it and think, yeah, 100%. And 10% of it, I'm like, well, maybe. And that, I think, is what all of us should do a little bit when we're listening to parenting experts. And I'm using air quotes when I say experts, because parenting is the most individual thing in the world. You got to parent the one in front of you. And anyone who has more than one kid, as you do, knows. You think you know everything. You finally figured out parenting with your first one. Then you go ahead and have a second one. And oh my gosh.
Totally different kid.
Totally different kid. Totally different temperament. You have to get a whole new toolbox for that kid.
Yeah.
So anyway, I just think it's okay to sometimes take what works for you from what someone says and leave what doesn't work for you.
Which is exactly why you were okay with me litigating you in parent baby class.
Yep.
Because I was like, wait a minute, let's back it up. And I hope that everyone that listens to the podcast does that for stuff that I present and stuff that you listen to from other parenting podcasts, or, as you said, quote unquote, experts, because there are a million different ways to be a fabulous parent.
Yep.
But I'm also a big believer, which, came out in that story about me litigating Christine. I'm a big believer, and so is Christine, in evidence-based practices.
Yep.
And making sure that we're not just shooting from the hip. I mean, sometimes we are, let's be honest. Like sometimes that's that's the art part of parenting, right?
Right.
But sometimes there are things that we know are good for kids, and there are things that we know are bad for kids. For example, and this isn't the focus of today, but we know the science is unequivocally clear that hitting our children, spanking our children, is damaging to their brain development, to like all sorts of things, right? That's unequivocal.
Right.
But then how you parent outside of that, corporal punishment, like then there's a bunch of gray.
Right. Or the one that I always talk about, because I do spend so much of my professional work talking to parents with babies, there are measurable consequences to letting babies cry and nobody comes. Unresponsive parenting has lasting impact on the brain mapping. And so let's look at the data, what we know. And I 100% agree. I always like to look at evidence-based best practice care and then help parents to find their own way within what does the data teach us?
Yes.
Also, let's look at the child as an individual.
100%. Okay. So then with all of that, because you guys, those of you who know me know I can talk for a long time, but you put Christine and I together, and I mean, we could record,
some topics that we're passionate about.
Yeah.
And buckle up.
Buckle up. But today we are going to talk about feeding and bodies and body image and, all things sort of related to that, because it's something that Christine talks about and teaches. And it's something that's really prominent in my mind as well. For many of you who are listeners are women, and bodies and body image have probably been something you've thought about once or twice. Mm-hmm. It's certainly something that, that I have, but also I'm now the parent of a high schooler, and I see the challenges that come with that and the messaging that she gets and that her friends get. And frankly, it's kind of scary. So,
and how do you raise children who have a healthy relationship with food and love their bodies, have self-love in a culture that makes it almost impossible.
Yeah.
Our culture just inundates us with freaky, messed up messages about food and tells us, especially as women, but everybody, that we're supposed to hate our bodies, that we're supposed to change our bodies. And as we age, we're especially supposed to hate our bodies. And it is a really hard place to love yourself and to love food and have a good relationship with food, even as an adult who does the research and thinks these things through. How are our kids supposed to navigate this, and how can we help them with that?
Right. And one of the questions that always comes up for me when this topic gets broached is, I mean, we live in a super fat phobic culture, right? Shaming anyone for their body size or their appearance or whatever is never, ever, ever okay, ever. Whether it's yourself, someone you see on the street, your child, someone that's on TV, whatever. It's not okay. And we also recognize that, again, going back to evidence-based practices, that, you know, most of us as parents want our kids to be healthy.
Right.
Right. And so how do we talk about messaging around health without talking about messaging around the size and shape of their body and like self-love and what the intersection of all of that is? And I feel like there was something else I was going to say in there and can't remember.
Well, one of the things that I really like is that some of the people I think who are doing the best job talking about this are talking about weight neutral conversations, weight neutral relationship to health, so that we're not talking about being a specific weight or a specific size as linked with our child's health. And that means not talking about being a specific weight or a specific size for our own health. And because, as every single parent who's listening knows, your kids are always listening. And so if you stand in the kitchen and say, oh, well, I can't have that, I'm off carbs. Carbs are mommy's enemy. And, if you stand in front of the mirror and you grab your tummy and you say, oh, I have got to lose some weight. Your child is watching. Your child now thinks that some foods are better than other foods. Some things are our enemy, and that there's a hierarchy of foods and all of this stuff that we can talk about. And then they also think that I've got to lose some weight is an important part of health.
Right.
So it's for sure true that some of us losing weight is a part of our health goals, and you can love your body and still have goals for your body. But how we talk about that to ourselves and in front of our children is super important.
It is. But I also want to say, as we're talking about this, Christine and I are not magically good at this. We're not immune to any of the messaging. And for full disclosure, like, no joke, we're hitting record on an episode to talk about body and body image. And we're both looking in the Zoom camera, trying to make sure that we're at the right angle and that it's catching the best side of us, right?
Like, I'm super annoyed with my friend that she didn't tell me this was going to be video, because I would have done something different with the look.
Right. Well, but I said it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter.
Okay. So anyway, just wanted to put that full disclosure that we're not perfect at this.
But I think that's one great thing that I hope people take away from thinking about this with their own kid, is that even things like pediatrician visits, that let's make them health-focused medical visits and not visits about the child's weight. I know there's been a lot of press about this lately, just seen all different places where professionals are talking about eliminating conversations about BMI from pediatrician visits.
Well, let's be honest, the whole BMI thing is bullshit anyway.
It's meaningless. Yep. It is a meaningless metric that has nothing to do with health. And yet it's still a part of many pediatric questionnaires, So it's part of our job to advocate for our kids at their medical appointments. And so to go in and before you start any conversation in front of your child, to say to their physician or the nurse or the office manager, it's important to me that we don't talk about my child's weight or my child's BMI at this appointment.
Yeah.
And if you have any concerns about it, shoot me an email or we can talk about that, not in front of my child.
Yeah. I want to back up though, because
let's back up.
Yeah, because that's a conversation that comes in when our kids start to, grow and get older and they're eating their own food. But you talk a lot. And in fact, I was concerned as a new parent about, and as somebody who has, gone up and down in my weight and struggled with that over the course of my life. Like I wanted to make sure I was doing right by my kid, now kids, and was giving them good information and like talking to them about it in the right way and not doing damage. As parents, I think we all want to start from a place of like, do no damage, right? I mean, we're all going to screw up our kids in one way or the other, but at least sometimes we can be aware of it. So I took a class from you, Christine, that talked about feeding. Well, and throughout the parent baby class that sort of led eventually to the Heartful Parent, we talked about breastfeeding and bottle feeding and how does that all play into this long-term picture of body image and health and all of that?
Yeah, awesome. Okay. So to me, it all goes back to the idea of the division of labor around having a healthy relationship with food. And I know this has come up in previous episodes of your podcast. And also, I'm sure your listeners know from you introducing me, I am not a registered dietitian or a nutritionist. I have worked with lots of RDs, but I'm a parenting educator and I'm a lactation educator and an infant feeding specialist. And so I often approach things starting from when this human being is a baby. And a baby in the first year of life has a perfect relationship with food. 100% of their nutrition comes from the milk feedings, whether that's breast milk or formula or a combination of both. And a baby at the breast has all the control. They come to the breast, they eat when they're hungry, they stop when they're satisfied. And sometimes they will just stop transferring milk, but they'll stay latched onto the breast. So every person listening who has breastfed a baby probably has had that experience where they're looking down and they're like, oh, she's done. She's finished. And they go to take the baby off. And the baby's like, oh, no, not done. No, not done. And they're like fluttering their little lips, but they're not transferring any milk anymore. Mm-hmm. So they're not finished with the nursing. They're not finished with the connection, the skin to skin, the hormone transfer that's happening between the parent and the baby. They're just finished with the milk. Yeah. And it turns out that that's super important for brain mapping. I eat when I'm hungry and I stop when I'm satisfied. And so for decades, there was this research that showed that bottle-fed babies were more likely to be obese as adults than breastfed babies. And originally, they thought that this was because of the composition of human milk versus the composition of formula and the way that interacts with the GI and all that, which some of that is true. But it also turns out that it's about the mode of delivery. Because at the breast, the baby has all the control. And when we're giving a bottle, the parent has the control. And so the way we were bottle feeding back in the day was this big open hole that you'd put the bottle in your baby's mouth, you'd squeeze, the milk would just pour into the back of their throat in a straight stream, and they had to swallow it, or they would sputter and choke. And nobody ever thought to take the bottle away, to give the baby a break, to give the baby any control. And so that was what was mapping the neural pathways for not I eat when I'm hungry, I'm stop when I'm satisfied, but I keep eating until they take it away. And so what this super cool research showed that babies who had been bottle fed in that way, when they were given a cup at 2 years old, they were much more likely statistically to actually finish everything in the cup than the babies who had been breastfed or the babies who had been bottle fed in the way that we now call paced feeding. So some of you probably were taught paced feeding. I always want to say PACED, not PASTE, because it sounds like paste feeding. Like
here's some good Elmer's.
It's not. It's paste, PACED. And all it means is that we're giving the baby breaks. We're letting the baby decide, do I want more? There are lots of great resources for learning more about paced feeding, but that's the way that bottle feeding is taught now. And it's so that babies are mapping these neural pathways, listening to their internal cues in that whole first year of life when the milk feedings are the composition of their nutrition. And then after a year, when we're introducing more and more solids, and the solid foods are actually making up some of the child's nutrition, this is when they start responding more to external cues and not just listening to those internal, I stop when I'm satisfied. So, are they offering me more? Okay, I guess I'll eat more. Oh, wait, is everybody else at the table having seconds? Oh, okay, I guess I'll have seconds. Or, oh, look, my whole family snacks in front of the TV. I'll snack in front of the TV, right?
Well, don't you think this is also a time, not just when the child is paying attention to what's going on around them, but when parents start to decide, like even if they were breastfeeding, right?
Mm-hmm.
And even if they were letting their 6-month-old decide that they were done eating, suddenly they start eating solids, and we get all sorts of opinions about how much they should eat, when they should, like when they're full. You can't possibly be full. You've only had 2 bites. Keep eating more.
Yep.
Right. And so it's not just them paying attention, but it's us. If we weren't bottle feeding and taking control at that stage, now we desperately as parents want control.
Oh, yes. And it's, first of all, I get it. It is the most primal thing in the world to need to know that your child is growing and getting what they need. There is no denying that I'm sure anybody is worried about making sure their baby is getting enough, or their toddler is getting enough, or, oh my gosh, did my teenager eat anything green this week? I don't know that she put one vegetable in her body. And it's very primal. So I am not dismissing that at all, how difficult that is as a parent that need to know that your kid is getting what they need.
Yeah.
And then
can I just say, I had to pause as you were saying that and think, is my teenager eating vegetables this week? I'm not sure. I don't know.
And then I know that this is an even bigger concern for those of you who have challenges around feeding, whose babies started in the NICU, who you were measuring cc's of input and cc's of output and counting wet diapers for weeks to make sure this baby was growing. I know this is a way bigger concern for those of you with kids with food aversions or special needs. And so this is a multi-layered conversation. Plus, every single one of us brings to the table, literally to the table, the way we were raised and our own relationship with food. And just as I know that you talk a lot about people who are trying to undo generational trauma around parenting, and people who were shamed or people who were spanked, are trying to undo that and not shame or spank their children. Some of you were raised with really controlling practices around food. You have to at least try it. We're not leaving this table until you at least take a thank you bite, or no dessert until you are a clean plate, or we could tell a million stories. These very culturally dominant practices around food that maybe some of us are trying to undo because they haven't served us well as adults, and our own relationship with food.
Can I just interject with a story?
Tell it.
Okay.
That's the storytellers are the wisdom keepers.
The wisdom keepers. Okay. I don't know if this is wisdom, but I think it's kind of humorous. So when I was growing up, I had a best friend, and we kind of did everything together. And she spent time with my grandparents, and I spent time with her grandparents, and we knew each other's parents and everything. And one summer, I guess. And I was probably, I'm going to guess 12, somewhere in that range, not fully a teenager yet, but like knew my own kind of mind or whatever. And we were spending time with her grandparents, and they, this was in the Pacific Northwest, and they had a boat, and it was like a boat that they slept on. And so her grandmother had cooked us dinner on this boat, and she and I and her brother were eating our dinner that her grandmother had cooked us out on the back of this boat. And her grandmother had cooked spaghetti squash, which I will just say, none of us were a fan of. I don't think I'd ever had it before. And that just was not a part of my family's food culture. And we like looked at it. I think we tried it and we decided it was disgusting. But the rule was to go to these rules about food. Mm-hmm. You may not have dessert until your plate is clean, right? That was the rule. You have to finish everything on your plate. And so my friend and I and her brother all looked at each other and we went, let's huck it overboard.
Yeah.
Okay.
I knew that was coming.
Word to the wise. Spaghetti squash floats.
Oh, no. Oh, no.
So we're sitting on the back of this boat, like hoping that her grandmother does not come out there as we're trying to take like a paddle or something. We're in the marina, right? We're in a marina and we're trying to get the like spaghetti squash to like go over to the boat next to us so that nobody could see that we'd thrown the spaghetti squash over and we could actually get our dessert.
Oh my God.
And I think we got it out of the way just in the nick of time as her grandmother came out. But like it was, and I think about that story and the fact that spaghetti squash floats and I giggle, but also I think that there was some pretty, clear messaging there about the hierarchy of food. I was just
going to say, you have to get through the indignity of spaghetti squash before you get to the glory of ice cream, right? You've set up this hierarchy of foods, and we do that all the time in our culture. And we see it with babies that if somebody hands a baby, never had anything in their mouth other than breast milk or formula, hands them their first bites of solids, right? And so if we give them a slice of a peach and they hold on to it and they're sucking on it and they're kind of licking it and they'll make a face and they're like, and what the parents or the grandparents will say, oh, look at her. Oh, it's juicy. Oh, she likes it. If you hand that baby a piece of steamed broccoli and she licks it and she kind of gums it or whatever, and she makes the exact same faces because she's never had anything in her mouth other than her breast milk or formula. And she starts making faces and we go, oh, she doesn't like it. It's bitter. Oh, she's just like you. She doesn't eat green food. Or, all the things we say from the very first bites of food in our culture, we are establishing this hierarchy of foods.
And telling them what they like and what they don't like.
Yes. So that's one of my number one tips for families is when we talk about the division of labor is don't talk about it. Your job is to serve the food to your kid, whether that kid is 8 months old or 8 years old or 14 years old. You decide what, when, and where. So here's your division of labor. And your child's job is to decide whether they eat it and how much they eat. So go back to the milk feedings, that first year of life where they have a perfect relationship with food. I decide what, where, and when. Right now, breast milk in this chair, right? My baby decides whether she wants it and how much she wants. And my breasts aren't calibrated, so I don't know how much she got, but she either falls asleep or, gets antsy. So I offer the second side or whatever. Same thing with the baby who's exclusively bottle fed. I decide what, when, and where. Okay. This chair right now, bottle of formula. Baby decides whether, yes, please, how much. Well, I made a 3-ounce bottle, but baby fell asleep after 1.5 ounces. Nobody wakes that baby up and says, come on, you got to finish it. Mommy worked hard on this. You got to be a clean plater. We're not leaving this couch until you drink the last ounce and a half. I mean, we would just never say any of those super controlling messages. We'd be like, oh, I guess she was done. She only needed an ounce and a half, and you put it down. Nobody says to the baby who has popped off the breast and is happily looking at her hand or, watching the dog or whatever. Nobody says, come on, you have to at least try the second side. You have to take a thank you sip of the second side. Right? It's just ludicrous. Thanks for laughing at that.
Yeah.
It's ludicrous that we would be so controlling about the milk feedings because we're giving the baby this control. Why can't we do that with the solid foods, right?
Yeah.
Just you decide what, when, and where, and then they decide whether they're going to eat it and how much they're going to eat. And don't talk about it. Because the other really big part of this is kids want control. They want
all
power.
the time. Yeah.
All the time.
This is one of the, we talk about this in positive discipline a lot, and we don't need to go into detail now, but that's one of the times where we see their behavior derail is when we have taken too much control and they are feeling they have no control. And that affects that sense of belonging and significance that every human has a need for, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, keep going.
Well, wait, and just rewind because of what you said about belonging and significance makes me think of connection and heartfulness and everything that our goal is in connecting with our children. The very first thing out of my mouth should have been, I want you all to have meal times as peaceful, connected, heartful times in your family, and not a time for battles of will, super controlling parenting practices, fights, tears, you're grounded, you're sassy. That eating is wonderful. It's one of life's greatest joys. And it's a time of connection and togetherness in your family. And so take away the power struggles and let it be joyful and heartful. And okay, so now circling back, what I was talking about with control is at every single age, at every single stage, ultimately our kids are trying to separate from us, right?
I know, damn it. It's really annoying.
Daddy.
We do that.
I should have started this with, I have 3 grown children, all of whom have successfully separated from me and are making their way in the world.
And one of them who used to babysit my children.
Yeah.
Yes.
Anyway, how your child tries to get some control is often around food because you make them wear shoes and you make them do their homework and you make them take a bath and you make them brush their teeth and you make them sit in a 5-point harness in the back seat. And all of the things that we do, your child ultimately at all these different ages only has 100% of the control over 2 things: whether they swallow the food and where they poop. Don't ever make one of those things about a battle of wills in your home, because ultimately you will lose. And I can tell you, I have a very vivid memory of my dad telling me, you are not leaving this table until you eat that coleslaw. Okay.
Oh, it was broccoli for me. I have the same memory.
I can picture this pile of coleslaw. You all, I'm in my 50s. So this was not recently, right? And for whatever reason, my dad dug his heels in and he said, you are not leaving this table until you eat that. And I couldn't do it. And for whatever reason, I could not choke down that coleslaw. And maybe it was because I didn't like the taste of it or whatever, which we can talk about in a minute, because some of you, your kids are more sensitive to taste and texture. But maybe it was because I was at a stage where I was trying to assert some independence, find some control. I was feeling crushed by my parents' parenting or whatever. So I also dug my heels in. And what I remember is that not only did everybody else leave the table, my siblings had long since left the table. The dishes had been done. I don't know where my mom was. My sister and brother had both gone to bed, and I was still sitting at the table looking at that coleslaw. I wasn't going to do it. You know what, mister? I win on this 100% of the time. If you dig your heels in over food and they dig their heels in over food, the child will win because you can't make them swallow the food. So just don't go there.
Yeah.
Don't get into a battle of wills over food.
Well, and not only because they'll win, but because if we go back to that connection and control piece, right? The belonging and significance, like with every moment that we're trying to get them to do something. Now, okay, they do have to do things like their homework and whatever, right? There are things we have to get them to do.
Right.
But when we get into fights over things we don't need to get into fights over, like, do you eat 3 bites or 4 bites? Or, do you eat the broccoli tonight or not? Or the coleslaw? We're breaking connection.
And is this the hill I'm going to die on?
Yeah.
That is a question I'm asking as a parent 10 times a day. And it's certain phases of parenting 100 times a day. Is this the hill I'm going to die on? Man, some days and some phases with kids, you feel like all you do is say no, don't, and stop. And
teenager, is that the teenage years?
And toddler.
Like, I'm pretty
teenager,
sure.
toddler, baby.
Yeah.
And if I have to set a boundary and enforce that boundary 75 times in the hours between when you got home from school and when we hug each other goodnight, I don't want to add food to that. I want eating to just be a time of connection. And so I'm going to decide what is offered and present it to you, and you are going to eat it or not eat it. And that's okay. You're in charge of your body, little person. But then don't ask me to go make something different. I'm not a short order cook. This is what we're having: chicken, asparagus, some rice, a salad,
Yeah.
And what if your child only eats the chicken and they don't eat any of the asparagus or the salad? They just shovel in chicken and rice. Is this a problem?
I mean, I think a lot of parents would say, yeah, they need vegetables.
Right. But they did their job. The division of labor says you did your job, they did their job. You offered chicken and rice and asparagus and salad, and they decided whether to eat, yes, and how much. Some chicken and some rice. And so you don't have to talk about, don't you want to try the asparagus? I made it the way you like it. Buddy, I thought you liked roasted asparagus. Last week I made roasted asparagus. You ate it. And the more you talk about it, the more this kid goes, watch me make these monkeys dance. They care so much whether I take a bite of this asparagus. And now it has become the axis around which this whole family is spinning, whether or not I'm going to take a bite of asparagus, or, honey, did you have any salad? When's the last time you ate something green? You need green food so you have energy. All of the things we say that make the kid think I have all the power in the world. And these parents are so jacked up about whether or not I take a bite of this. Let's just see what happens if I never eat asparagus again. So don't talk about it.
Yeah. I mean, I learned all of this from you 14 years ago. And I ended up with one kid who will eat anything. And as I'm listening to you talk, I'm like, I think I've slipped into saying things like, because my younger one, she would subsist on French fries if I let her. I mean,
so would I, by the way.
But yeah, I mean, who wouldn't?
Right?
They are amazing.
You have French fries?
They are amazing. And not terribly nutritionally complete. And so, I'm just thinking of things that both my husband and I have probably said that aren't probably helping the situation, although she's a pretty easygoing kid, but except when it comes to food. All right, listeners, I hope you got so much out of that first part of my conversation with Christine. It's always a challenge to figure out, when we end up recording a long conversation like that, where do we break it up and where do we pick up next time? So I hope you feel like, oh, you got some good stuff and you want to hear more. because Christine will be back. We'll finish up that conversation 2 weeks from now, so the week after Thanksgiving. In the meantime, next week, we're going to dive into, it feels appropriate as we approach U.S. Thanksgiving, and I know not everyone listening is U.S. based, but whether you're U.S. based or not, whether you celebrate Thanksgiving or not, however that, this time of year and that holiday lands for you, the conversation next week is for you, because it's about gratitude and the ways that gratitude can actually change our brain chemistry and the things that it can do for us that are really quite remarkable. So we'll dive into that a bit next week. And then as we're all coming off our food comas after Thanksgiving, again, if you partake in that, we will follow up with Christine and finish off this conversation with some great questions and food for thought and all of the above. Have a great week, and I'll see you next week.